Hey guys, this is Kevin, Sean, Himanshu, and Akash. We're going to be talking about the progressive era today.
By the late 19th century, America was no longer a developing agricultural country. With the rise of industrialism and machinery, large corporations had sprung up, great cities had developed, and railroads and telegraphs connected people from all over the country in ways that had never been possible. Native and foreign trade flourished, fueling the expanding economy. The Second Industrial Revolution introduced new technologies that would allow for drastic changes in everyday lifestyles of citizens, as well as major improvements in production speed and efficiency in factories. However, with all this industrialization and development, businesses were able to grow larger and larger, and soon these companies would begin to dominate politics and the lives of citizens, in some cases to a greater extent than even the United States government. The massive corporations began to outcompete smaller businesses, and soon their industries would become a monopoly for them. A lack of regulations made consumers vulnerable to the greed of business owners who attempted to maximize profits, resulting in poor labor conditions and miserable wages. Laborers started forming unions, and violent protests and strikes occurred. Muckrakers exposed horrible actions that big businesses use in order to grow. It became obvious that something had to be done with the unfair balance in power and the widespread corruption. The solution to this problem came from reformers who were known as progressives. These reformers sought to fix many of the problems that had plagued America ever since industrialization occurred. The ideas that these reformers supported eventually became known as progressivism. Although initial efforts were never on a nationwide scale due to the lack of influence in the government, their influence began to grow, and soon Theodore Roosevelt, a progressive, assumed the presidency. Roosevelt led the United States into a period of reform that would help balance power and fix countless problems that plagued the nation.
Theodore Roosevelt's Square Deal policy had a very progressive agenda. It included regulating trusts and corporations, protecting consumers, and conserving the environment. Roosevelt became president during a time period when government intervention was out of fashion. Previous presidents had been weak and used laissez-faire principles. Roosevelt, on the other hand, was very forceful and did not let the country just run on its own. The Jungle, published by Upton Sinclair, described the disgusting meatpacking process and caused Roosevelt to immediately push for the signing of the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, both of which were to protect consumers. The Jungle was an example of yellow journalism. Yellow journalism, which was often published by muckrakers, attempted to expose corruption to the public and aroused protest against these practices, which helped push for passage of acts that outlawed them.
Muckrakers played an invaluable role in gathering support for progressive legislation and reform. Named after the man with a muckrake in John Bunyan's classic Pilgrim's Progress, these journalists used books and articles to expose corruption to the public. As discussed before, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle sent shockwaves through the world by displaying images of unsanitary conditions and alien objects, including human fingers, entering meat that many people were consuming. Lincoln Steffen's book, The Shame of the Cities, described political corruption in cities to the public. Ida Tarbell almost single-handedly brought down the Standard Oil Trust with her magazine publications on the history of Rockefeller's Trust. Jacob Riis helped improve living conditions of millions through his use of photojournalism in the publication of How the Other Half Lives. The impact of muckrakers was essential to the success of progressives, and their publications will become world-renowned.
One of the most prominent issues that progressives face were monopolies. Businesses seeking to increase profit utilize vertical and horizontal integration to take complete control of their industry. Industrialization created massive machines that allowed companies to mass produce their products. Small businesses were unable to purchase these instruments as they were very expensive. In addition, utilization of horizontal integration resulted in monopolies, as large corporations would buy up all companies that it competed with. With no competition, the company was free to do whatever they wanted, including raise prices on products and change production rates. One example of horizontal integration was the John D. Rockefeller Oil Trust. His method included controlling the industry by making smaller companies yield their stock. Eventually, the smaller companies would be absorbed by Rockefeller's trust. This was not only unfair to small businesses, but it was also unjust to consumers and laborers. The long-famed American dream became impossible as the massive companies would destroy any chance of a startup business growing by either outcompeting them or absorbing them. Individuals who moved to America seeking the American dream realized that the only possible way to earn money was to become a laborer. However, laborers suffered poor conditions, long work hours, and miserable wages, which would never lead to prosperity. Consumers had to pay increasingly high prices for a product that wasn't any bit more valuable. One notable example of this was railroads. Farmers who needed to transport their crops to cities faced rising transportation prices despite stable operating costs for railroad companies. This hurt farmers, as they started to earn less and less money simply due to the greed of monopolies. Theodore Roosevelt started to regulate monopolies, splitting up trusts that he believed were quote-unquote bad. Roosevelt became known as the trust buster for this, although he acted as more of a trust regulator. One notable trust that Roosevelt did separate was the Northern Securities Company, which was owned by J.P. Morgan and operated railroads. Legislation against monopolies and price discrimination were passed and included the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act. The Interstate Commerce Commission was strengthened to expand its jurisdiction and allow it to set reasonable freight rates. When Taft became president, he would break up many more trusts than Roosevelt did, acting as a true trust buster. Although monopolies still existed after the Progressive Movement, their influence had declined greatly, and few trusts truly dominated their region of exploits. With the trusts limited, the American dream became more of a reality.
In addition to businesses, many problems also plagued politics. Parties influenced voting by using money to persuade people to vote for their candidate. State legislators, not the people, were responsible for election of senators, resulting in many state senators not being the favored candidate of the people. Problems that affected the citizens the most were often ignored by state governments due to indirect representation, and government officials were free to do whatever they wanted once elected. In order to resolve these issues, progressives pushed for initiative, referendum, recall, secret ballots, and the direct election of senators by citizens. Initiative allowed citizens to propose legislation and bypass the state legislators. Referendum allowed people to decide whether certain laws that the state legislature allowed citizens to vote on would be passed or not. Recall allowed citizens to remove a state government official before their term was over. This is similar to the process of impeachment of the president. These three processes gave citizens more power to fix problems in their state governments. Secret ballots kept money and other exterior factors from influencing voting. Direct election of senators came with the creation of the 17th Amendment and made sure that senators elected to Congress actually represented the people of the state. These reforms allowed citizens to not only have greater control over their government, but also allowed them to have more control over their lives.
Reform was also evident for labor during the Progressive Era. Laborers benefited from compensation, a minimum work age, and the limit on work hours. The Adamson Act gave interstate railroad workers an 8-hour workday and additional pay for overtime work. The Supreme Court case Mueller v. Oregon upheld Oregon's 10-hour working limit for women. Many states followed after. Holden v. Hardy upheld laws restricting work hours for minors. Although major changes were not implemented during the Progressive Era, regulations were created to help benefit laborers.
The Progressive Era also brought great reforms in the education spectrum. There was an overall shift towards the ideas of efficiency and scientific management to be implemented into education. A main difference between schools of the 1870s and the Progressive Era were attendance rates. Before the Progressive Era, most children would only attend schools for a few months and spend the rest of their time helping their families in what was mostly an agrarian society. However, the Progressive Era introduced an expanding middle class who did not need their children helping in the fields, allowing them to attend school. In addition, new laws were passed in certain states requiring children to go to school till the age of 14. This ensured that all children, regardless of background, would get at least some education. Along with public schooling, higher education experienced reform evident even today. The Progressive Era impacted the college and university atmosphere, mainly due to the amount of colleges and universities made from the federal funds of the Memorial Acts of 1862 and 1890. One major reform was the broadening of the curriculum in response to technological changes. More and more higher education facilities started to experiment with new curriculum ideas. For example, Harvard University started substituting electives for required courses, and state universities, such as the University of Wisconsin, created a focus on previously unknown studies like political science, economics, and sociology. In addition, philosopher John Dewey published The School and Society and Democracy and Education, which focused on giving children education that would apply in real life. These reforms allowed students to gain more knowledge in a wide variety of topics. As a result of industrialization, America's exports grew rapidly throughout the 19th century and were quickly overtaking the amount of imports the country received. This favorable trade was helped by the open door policy that Theodore Roosevelt advocated to China, as well as friendly trade relations to other nations. Exports to Great Britain and many European countries were so great that Europeans complained of an American invasion of goods. In addition, the progressives looked to Britain and other European nations for influence. Settlement houses, an idea adapted from Britain, were established in many big cities, and workers attempted to improve living conditions of the poor settlers of these houses. Progressivism was greatly influenced by foreign nations, and flourished while the nation maintained healthy relations with other countries.
As the country grew from favorable trade, immigrants from all over the world came to America in search of opportunity. The American dream was a goal for most of these people, and they came in great numbers. 15 million immigrants arrived in America between 1900 and 1915. The United States had great difficulty absorbing all the new immigrants. Major cities in the north were the most affected. The cities not only had to deal with the millions of immigrants moving in, but also the numerous African Americans that were also coming to avoid Jim Crow laws in the South. In the end, the United States population grew by 33% from 1900 to 1915, and New York City's population swelled from 2.5 million in 1890 to 5.5 million in 1920.
Although the majority of changes that progressives made involved people in business, progressive presidents were conservationists who seek to conserve the environment. Roosevelt worked to preserve forests, and later on, progressive President Woodrow Wilson created the National Park System. Guilford Pinchot, chief of the United States Forest Service, led many conservationist efforts, including the moving of the forest to the Agricultural Department to force people to pay fees for cutting trees and allowing their animals to graze. Taft added thousands of acres of forest reserves. These efforts allowed important landmarks and wildlife to be preserved for future generations.
Although the Progressive Era reformed many problems of the 19th century, glaring issues still remain. Black people were still treated as inferiors and denied basic rights. Court cases struck down many laws that had restricted child labor. Workers' wages were not increased enough to significantly change their conditions, and many continued to live in great poverty. Big businesses, although limited in power, still dominated economics. The Progressive Era came to an end after World War I, when the movement lost the support of many war-weary Americans, and the government started backing big businesses again over laborers. Although the progressives reformed many problems of the 19th century, many issues were left to be resolved.